Thank you all for coming. Welcome. My name is David Bates, and I'm a professor here at Berkeley in the Department of Rhetoric. And on behalf of Alan Tansman, the director of the Townsend Center for the Humanities, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight for the UNA's lecture. As many of you may know, the UNA's lectures were endowed in 1969 as part of the UNA's gift by Mr. Edward Hunter Ross in honor of his wife, Una Smith Ross. She wanted the UNA's gift to be an endowment for inviting distinguished scholars in the field of the humanities to Berkeley for the purpose of delivering lectures, meeting with faculty and students, and conducting or participating in seminars and colloquia. This year, the UNA's lecture will be given by the philosopher Catherine Malabou, to my right, who is visiting Berkeley for a full month. And besides tonight's lecture, she's also teaching a special graduate seminar. She's participated in a conference already and another one this coming week, very much in the spirit of the bequest. So we want to thank her for all the time she's putting in here at Berkeley. Catherine Malabou currently teaches at the Center for Research in Modern European Philosophy at Kingston University in London. Prior to this appointment, she was for many years professor at the Université de Paris 10 at Nanterre, and she has twice been visiting professor in rhetoric at Berkeley. She studied at the École Normale under the great Descartes scholar Jean-Luc Marion and Jacques Derrida, writing a thesis on Hegel and the concept of plasticity, which became her first book, translated into English as The Future of Hegel, Plasticity, Temporality, and Dialectic. Professor Malabou then did, I think, a remarkable thing for a young academic in the humanities. She realized that the central philosophical concept of her work, namely plasticity, turned out to be most alive today in the discipline of neuroscience, not philosophy. So she began an intensive and profoundly original engagement, sometimes even collaboration, with contemporary cognitive science and neurobiology, where, she asked, can we locate the role of philosophical critique within these materialist understandings of human thinking? Without ever diminishing the importance of neuroscientific research, Professor Malabou has, in her clear and elegant prose, persistently challenged us all to think very carefully about what it means to be a neural subject in the present age. This path between philosophy and neuroscience has been marked by several notable publications, many of which are now translated into English. For example, just a few to give an indication: What Should We Do with Our Brain, originally 2004, Plasticity at the Dusk of Writing, Dialectic, Destruction, Deconstruction, The New Wounded, From Neurosis to Brain Damage, and The Ontology of the Accident, an essay on destructive plasticity. Her most recent book is entitled Self and Emotional Life, Merging Philosophy, Psychoanalysis, and Neuroscience, which was written with Adrian Johnson and published last year. Tonight, Professor Malabou will give a talk entitled Odysseus Changed Soul, a contemporary reading of Plato's myth of So please join me in welcoming Catherine Malabou.
Okay, thank you very much, David, for this very nice introduction. Thank you all for coming. And thank you to the Center for the Humanities for inviting me for this wonderful visit. Okay, so I start without further ado. The myth of air forms the conclusive part of Plato's Republic. So let me first briefly recall its content and structure. Socrates introduces the story by explaining to Glaucon, his interlocutor, that the choices we make and the character we develop in this life will have consequences after death. He starts narrating the myth to give an account of the reward and punishment that the just and the unjust person, respectively, receive after death. The story begins as a man named the son of Arminius of Pamphylia, is given a chance to witness what occurs after death and is brought back to life to tell what he has seen. How come? Is supposed to have died in battle, but when the bodies are collected 10 days after, remains undecomposed. 2 days later, he revives on his funeral pyre, and when he wakes up, he tells others of his journey in the afterlife. When soul arrives in Hades, I quote Plato, the judges said that he was to be a messenger to human beings to tell them about the things happening there, and they told him to listen to and to look at everything in the place. So is the messenger between Hades and this earth. What did he see in Hades, and what is he able to tell us about afterlife? Let's distinguish three main moments in the myth. The myth starts by telling us that the souls of those judged to have lived justly are sent upwards to heaven to enjoy a beautiful sojourn for 1,000 years. The souls of those judged to have been unjust, by contrast, go under earth to be punished. The souls of those who committed serious crimes, mostly tyrants, receive especially severe punishment and are finally thrown into Tartarus. In 1,000 years, all the souls, except those eternally damned, join from up above and from down below and travel to the center of the universe, which is a meadow reigned by necessity. Second moment, the souls then come before Lachesis, one of the three fates, and are told to choose the lives that they are going to live for the coming reincarnation. Samples or models of lives, in Greek bios paradigma, are displayed, and the souls are each to pick up one from among them in turn. The order in which they choose has been decided by a lottery. After making the choice, each soul is given its own guardian, in Greek daimon, and is indissolubly bound to the chosen life. And in a third and last moment, the souls drink from the river Lethe and forget everything. And they are then born again to this world. Of course, Air is the only one who's not judged, who does not choose any life sample because he is a witness, and does not drink from the river because he comes back as the man he used to be to tell us what he has seen. In this presentation, I will focus on a specific moment of this myth, which is that of the choice of lives. The leading question of the seminar I'm conducting here is also determined by this moment. I'm wondering what we would do if we could live our lives over again. Would we choose the same, or would we opt for a different sample? In most cases, Plato says, it is very likely that we would choose the same. Such is one of the main lessons of the myth, that most often the souls pick up the same kind of life than the one they are used to. I quote Plato. Air said it was a sight worth seeing how the various souls chose their lives, since seeing it caused pity, ridicule, and surprise. For the most part, their choice reflected the character of their former life. In focusing on this very issue today, the choice of life in reincarnation, I will paradoxically examine the case of someone who does not select the same sample, but chooses, on the contrary, a new kind of life. A life which precisely is not the same than the former one, and this case is that of Odysseus. Because Odysseus is present in the myth, at the end of the myth. Let me read the passage which forms the core of my analysis. After the lots are thrown among the souls, each picks up one, as I said. And the name of Odysseus appears for the first time in 620 CE. I quote Plato. Now it chanced that Odysseus' soul drew the last lot of all and came to make its choice. Remembering its former sufferings, it rejected love of honor and went around for a long time looking for the life of a private individual who did his own work. And with difficulty, it found one lying off somewhere, neglected by the others. When it saw it, it said that it would have done the same, even if it had drawn the first place lot, and chose it gladly. End of quote. So we see that Odysseus chooses a different soul, a different life. He chooses to become a private individual who did his own work. The Greek is bion andros idiotou apragmonos, more accurately, the life of a private man who minds his own business. In other translations, we find that, a private man who minds his own business. This choice is highly perplexing. What can motivate it? Of course, it can be related to what Socrates says a little bit earlier in the text regarding the best kind of choice. The just, Socrates says, I quote, will know to choose the middle life in all circumstances and avoid either of the extremes, both in this life, so far as is possible, and in the whole of the life to come. for this is how a human being becomes happiest. We can then understand Odysseus' decision as being commanded by such an imperative of the middle. But at the same time, the extremes Socrates is talking about are wealth and other evils, and tyranny or other similar practices. And we know that none of these irreparable evils were committed by Odysseus. So why is he trying to avoid, what is he trying to avoid in choosing this mediocre life? The problem is all the more complex that no commentators generally pay acute attention to that choice. To my knowledge, the only genuinely profound analysis of Odysseus' choice is that of Patrick Deneen in his beautiful book called The Odyssey of Political Theory, The Politics of Departure and Return. Quote, many commentators of the myth of air do not pause to reflect on the grounds or rationale for admiring the particular life that the soul of Odysseus chooses. Those few that have reflected on the grounds for Odysseus' soul-specific choice agree that it is noteworthy, but disagree on the grounds. The complexity of Odysseus' gesture seems to add to the general difficulty of the myth, which many readers of the Republic have underscored. I quote, for example, from Stephen Halliwell, who's a great Platonician. He says, given the Republic's wavering images of the afterlife, Er's story appears out of nowhere, professing to carry an eschatological authority that the Republic not previously envisaged. Or, another quote, in a visionary mode whose complexity tests the limits of understanding, the narrative raises more questions than it can answer. A last quote from Julia Annas. The myth of air, she says, is a painful shock, offering a lame and messy ending to an otherwise infinite book. So the list could be much longer. And Odysseus' choice thus appears as a difficult moment in a difficult, if not incomprehensible, narrative. The myth stages a strange interplay between the three characters, Odysseus, and Socrates. It is true that each of them, in a way, might exchange his part with the two others. The myth of air has striking resemblances with Odysseus' journey in Hades, as related in Book 11 of Odyssey. Er's voice is in fact that of Socrates to the extent that it is Socrates who's speaking. And Socrates himself has common characteristics with both Odysseus and air. And at the same time, each of them remains different from the other. We may consider then that air, Odysseus, and Socrates exchange names in a loose or fluid identification process whose economy between difference and sameness remains to be brought to light. Let's focus now first on Odysseus. As Deneen still noticed very rightly, quote, Odysseus seems to choose exactly the life that most oppose his past history and seemingly his own disposition. In the page of the Odyssey, neither is Odysseus a private man. After all, he's the king of Ithaca, even when he's absent from his island, nor does he mind his own business. Indeed, minding one's own business requires one to avoid being a busybody, in Greek, polypragmonein, or literally avoid doing many things. And Odysseus, he of many ways, is the supreme example of the human who does many things. So the man who is neither private nor avoids doing many things is said to choose the seemingly opposite life when his soul is given the choice of all possible lives after death. Socrates is a private man in the sense that he does not seek public office, but he nevertheless does many things, and he does not mind his own business. Air is a soldier, an occupation which by definition is not a private one, and as a witness, he precisely not minds his own business either. So the exchangeability of the three characters contrasts with the unappealing style or mode of Odysseus' chosen second life. Again, we don't see what exactly motivates this choice and why it appears as the best one. So then, how can we understand it? How can we understand this choice of a banal model of life that a private bourgeois minding his own business? And can we understand it? Unless we imagine a reincarnation of the myth of air itself, a return of the myth in the 21st century, a new life, a rebirth of the narrative in a new framework or life paradigm. Would this help us to interpret Odysseus' choice differently? I assume that such is the case. I imagine the myth coming back today to help us propose a solution to one of the major political and philosophical issues of our time, that of the construction of sovereignty. More precisely, I imagine that Plato comes back on the scene to discuss Giorgio Agamben's statement, according to which it has become necessary, I quote, to think beyond the principle of sovereignty, beyond the sovereign ban, or to move out of the paradox of sovereignty. My interpretation of the myth is that it precisely gives us a very profound example of what relinquishing sovereignty may mean. In choosing to become a private man who minds his own business, Odysseus appears to dismiss or relinquish his sovereignty. According to Agamben, as developed in Homo sacer, the paradox of sovereignty consists in the fact that everything which sovereignty includes as an essential part of its definition is at the same time excluded by this definition itself. In reverse, what sovereignty excludes from its concept is at the same time essentially included in it. This strange situation, which constitutes the very foundations of sovereignty, its constitutive logic, pertains to the fact, as Agamben shows, that the concept of sovereignty coincides with that of exception. A coincidence which in effect is highly paradoxical because it means that exception is the rule. Sovereignty, Agamben says, implies, I quote, the state of exception as a permanent structure. If supreme power is founded on exception, it means that there is no way in which we can rigorously distinguish between the exceptional and the singular. Agamben again. The paradox of sovereignty consists in the fact that the sovereign is at the same time outside and inside. Outside and inside the juridical order. Outside and inside nature. Outside and inside violence. Outside and inside the law. And the book, Agamben's book, declines no less than 15 zones of indifference, both outside and inside spaces or spheres. What allows this paradoxical structure to exist is a relation. Sovereignty, by definition, is a relation with itself. This relation is a relation between normality and the excess, the allowed and the forbidden, once again between the inside and outside. I quote Agamben once more. It has often been observed that the juridico-political order has the structure of an inclusion of what is simultaneously pushed outside. Confronted with an excess, the system interiorizes what exceeds it through an interdiction, and in this way designates itself as exterior to itself. We shall give the name relation of exception to the extreme form of relation by which something is included solely through its exclusion. End of quote. Deconstructing sovereignty, then, implies the interruption of this self-foundation, of this self-sufficiency, of, again, the relation of the sovereign self to itself, defined as the origin of all limits or boundaries, as that which decides of the interior and the exterior, the inclusion and the exclusion, the rule and the exception. Heidegger, in his Humanities, comments on the myth of air and shows how, in ancient Greece, the relationship between interiority and exteriority, the inside and the outside, precisely appears as the relationship between the earth, or the above, and the underground. And we notice, of course, that since the beginning of the Republic, Plato's reflection on power, sovereignty, in Greek, basileia, and justice, is constantly sustained by a determination of the relationship between this world and the other world underneath, that is precisely between the inside and the outside. And as the myth of Earth teaches us, if nothing changes in Hades, in the underground world, if the unjust chooses the same model of life again, tyranny, abuse of sovereignty in general, will never end, and justice won't ever reign. Which is another way to say that if sovereignty cannot renounce to be both the interior and the exterior, the legal and the illegal, life and death, the sub and super-terrestrial, then the Republic cannot accomplish itself as the actualization of the philosophical ideal of justice. Again, something has to change and to be interrupted. And this is, according to me at that point, that Odysseus' choice appears and situates itself. But as I will show, we cannot understand it without considering it as a mirroring of or counter-answer to Air's and Socrates' lives and situations at the same time. But first, I have to ask, how did the idea of reading together the myth of Air and Agamben's book come to my mind? As I was reading and rereading the myth, it appeared to me that Air was exactly what Agamben calls an homo sacer, even if the first identifiable figure of the homo sacer is, according to Agamben, Roman and not Greek, a statement which my interpretation of the myth precisely attempts to challenge in a certain way. So what is an homo sacer? According to Agamben, the first concrete emergence of this figure as a political category is that of what the Romans called the devotus, a man, I quote, who is devoted by the consul, the dictator, or the praetor, in a word, by the sovereign, in order to save the city from a grave danger, end of quote. The devotus is a symbol. He's the symbol of the sovereign who acts in his place. So what did he do? On the war front, the homo sacer was exposed to death by being armed on a horse and plunged into the thick of the enemies, dressed in a specific cloak and before the eyes of both armies. He had the status of a living body that seemed no longer to belong to the world of the living. And we cannot help to think of Air at this point. The devotus, Agamben goes on, either dies and the ritual of devotion is accomplished, or he survives, which is precisely the case of Air. And Agamben is asking, I quote, what happens to the surviving devotee? The surviving devotee is a paradoxical being who, while seeming to lead a normal life, in fact exists on a threshold that belongs neither to the world of the living, not to the world of the dead. He is a living dead man, and we remember that Air is precisely a survivor, a living dead. Following Agamben's characterization, we might then see Air as the very symbol of the most extreme effect of the sovereign power, as the living pledge to his subjection to a power of death, to war, as someone who has entered into an intimate symbiosis with death without, nevertheless, belonging to the world of the deceased. Here, we grasp the intimate essence of sovereign power, which is, through war, for example, to exclude a living being from the inside of the community, in exposing it to be killed, in including this exclusion as the very symbol of power. The surviving devotee, homo sacer, Agamben says again, is a bare life that has been separated from its context, and that, so to speak, surviving its death, is for this reason incompatible with the human world. I will focus on the expression, a bare life that has been separated from its context, as it is exactly the case of air. This refers, bare life, to the distinction made earlier in the book by Agamben between two Greek words for life, zoe and bios. Zoe means bare life, natural life, and bios, qualified life. I quote Agamben again. Zoe, he says, expresses the simple fact of living common to all living beings, animals, men, or gods, natural life. Bios, on the contrary, indicates the form of way of living proper to an individual or a group. To separate a life from its context amounts to separate life from itself, to separate Zoe from bios. And precisely, the life of the homo sacer is a bare life without a bios, that is, without a qualification. A life which has no form, which only characteristic is the possibility to be killed. And once again, air in the myth has no form of life. According to Agamben, moving away from sovereignty, interrupting the sovereign's relationship to itself, implies that we erase the distinction between bios and zoe, that we suspend any relationship between them. I read from the very end of the book before going back immediately after to Plato. Emancipation from sovereignty, understood as absolute power, necessitate, Agamben says, a constitution and installation of a form of life that is wholly exhausted in bare life, and a bios that is only its own zoe, that is the end of the difference between biological life and political life or symbolic life. We just saw that air, precisely, was, as a living dead, had, as a living dead, a life separated from its context. In both his descent, that is his journey through Hades, and his ascent, his ascent and his descent, that is his awakening on the pyre, he's the one in the myth who does not have a form of life, what Plato calls a model of life, bios paradigm any longer. While traveling through the underground, he's not a soldier anymore, but a nobody, a witness with no qualities. He does not choose a new life like the other souls. He survives as a living being in the realm of death. And on that point, I would like to refer to Claudia Baracci's book of Myth, Life, and War in Plato's Republic, where she analyzes in a very interesting way the importance of war in this myth. So how will return to life once he has achieved his journey? How will he reconcile his zoe and his bios and overcome their separation? I'm now attempting to show how Odysseus' choice contains a possible answer to that question, a type of answer which paradoxically reveals the question, that is the genuine issue raised by the myth. An issue which, contrarily to what we thought in the beginning, is not so much that of choosing the best possible life. The particular examples described in the myth all appear as failed attempts to do so. No, but that of choosing a life whose possibility escapes the alternative of killing or being killed, escapes the sovereign alternative of murder and sacrifice. How, then the genuine question of Plato would be, how is it possible to return to life without being a murderer or a victim, a dictator or a devotee? And of course, as I said, Odysseus' choice also mirrors Socrates' situation. We can see that the model of life Odysseus chooses, that of a private man who minds his own business, precisely because of its neutrality, implies a neutralization of the distinction between bios and zoe. Odysseus chooses the life of a man whose qualification is that of having none. That is a non-exceptional type of life, that of a man who renounces his own state of exception. And this is the point where we find Socrates. Let me turn again to Denis's reading of the myth. He has this brilliant and very convincing remark. In the Republic, Odysseus' choice of souls in Book 10 has significant implications for the philosopher's choice whether to redescend to the cave in Book 7. A suggestion which sheds light on the philosopher's relationship to the city. Odysseus' choice would then be a veiled answer to the issue of the cave, how to go back there, how to return among the humans. As we know, the allegory of the cave describes the ascent of the philosopher, then posits the possibility of the philosopher redescending, a situation which is strikingly similar to the one described in the myth of air. How to redescend. The cave allegory describes the macabre, death-like existence in the cave, the true life afforded by ascent, and the unwilling return to the underworld. Here, in the myth, the return is a return to this life, and still the problem is the same. In any case, how are we to return? Apparently, it is clear that the philosopher has to descend in the cave again. Otherwise, he cannot affirm his non-sovereign or non-violent sovereignty. He cannot affirm his deconstruction of sovereignty. If the philosopher refuses to descend, the solution of the philosopher king to the problem of justice proves impossible. And Socrates is adamant on this point. He says, there is something which is not permitted. What's that? Glaucon asks. To remain there, he says, and not to be willing to go down again among those prisoners or share their labors and honors, whether they be slighter or more serious. So the problem is that how a non-sovereign sovereign can accept to go back to the cave, that is, to redescend. Of course, as Socrates evokes it in the course of his analysis, re-entering the cave for the philosopher involves the risk of being put at death by the hands of the crowd. The question of whether the philosopher, once having the bright land of truth above the cave, would choose to redescend to the subterranean region and try to rule, has raised a leading controversy in the reading of the allegory of the cave. The thesis that the philosopher would refuse to redescend was primarily established by Leo Strauss in his book The City and Man, and popularized by the great translator of the Republic, Alan Bloom, in his interpretive essay appended to the translation. I quote Bloom, "It is true that the potential philosophers must be compelled to leave the cave, as well as return to it. But once out, they recognize how good it is to be out. They never see a reason to go back, and compelling them to go back is said to be good for the city, but not the philosophers. If they thought it good to go back, they would not be good rulers. It is only by going out that they became aware that the Calliopolis is a cave, nay Hades, and that to be in it is as to be a shade." I also quote Dale Hall, another translator. Would the philosopher seek to rule the inhabitants of the cave at the risk of his own life? And again, Socrates admits that there is a significant danger in the philosopher's redescent. Once down, Socrates says, wouldn't he be the source of laughter? And wouldn't it be said of him that he went up and came back with his eyes corrupted, and that he's not even trying to go up? And if they were somehow able to get their hands on him and kill him, and if they were somehow able to get their hands on and kill the man who attempts to release and lead up, wouldn't they kill him? So Socrates is perfectly aware that redescending implies the risk of death. And now, I'm now slowly coming to the last moment of this talk. Odysseus' choice proposes an answer to that dilemma. If we are to return, we must not reveal ourselves as the ones we are in reality. We have to remain in disguise. And of course, we cannot but think that Odysseus' choice of life in the myth echoes his disguise as a beggar when he goes back to Ithaca in the Odyssey. We remember that Odysseus dresses as a beggar so that he can accustom himself to the new political situation of Ithaca before he appears as who he really is, the king. After all, nothing prevents us from thinking that the life of a private man who minds his own business can't be that of a poor man. Is not then the model of life chosen by Odysseus the right answer to our two issues, how to erase the distinction of Zoe and Bios, in order that we can return as actual deconstructors of sovereignty without at the same time being killed by the crowd and the sovereign himself? Is not the model of a private man minding his own business a way to dissimulate oneself and wait until the moment when one's own genuine identity can be revealed? Is not dressing as a beggar or a man without qualities a way to appear as a living dead, to occult one's power by wearing a mask? So is the mask the answer to all our questions? In order for kingship not to degenerate into abusive sovereignty, tyranny, violence, war, or sacrifice, the ruler who obeys the imperative of justice and gives priority to it over his own glory and power has to know how to hide or mask himself as long as necessary. Instead of choosing a model of life proper, we should choose a disguise which would allow our genuine proper model of life both to appear and disappear, without any strict distinction between the inside and the outside, inclusion and exclusion according to the circumstances. Socrates intervenes at that point, hiding behind Odysseus, helping us to determine what wearing a mask means. According to Socrates, we do have to know how to hide ourselves, but we also have to acknowledge the fact that most of the time, wearing a mask is not an interruption, but just a new ruse of sovereignty. That is why Socrates is and is not Odysseus. We remember that in Odyssey, Odysseus' disguise only prepares the moment of revenge. At some point when Odysseus reveals himself and starts fighting the suitors, seeking revenge from the new political order of Ithaca, which has been established in his absence. But he's not able to set up the situation by himself. He has to implore the help of Athena to put an end to the war. In the myth of air, it seems that Plato raises the question of wearing a mask in a way which is not a temporary ruse, as in the case of Odysseus, something which neutralizes sovereignty for just a moment, but as a permanent ontological displacement of sovereignty. Socrates himself is never in disguise. He may be compared to a beggar, but he's not one. He does not really wear a mask proper, which also means that he never has to reveal himself either. We remember that among the different models of paradigma available for choice, the life of a philosopher is nowhere to be found. Strangely, the philosophical life does not constitute a life sample. It is beyond Bios and Zoe. We then have to guess negatively what a Socratic model of life might be through Odysseus' choice, knowing at the same time that Odysseus can and cannot be Socrates' mask because Socrates has no mask. Disguise is just a momentary suspension of sovereignty, which can always end up in violence. So then, what could the Socratic life paradigm be? I will turn toward Agamben one last time. In order to move away from the sovereign exception, we have, according to him, to think of a kind of power which is at the same time a non-power, something which he calls impotentiality. A power whose potentiality never actualizes itself, a pure virtuality. It is not about pretending to be a beggar outside and being a king inside. It is about being no one. The model of life of such an impotent soul for him is certainly not that of Odysseus, but that of Bartleby, Melville's character. Bartleby is the perfect example of a life which is indistinguishably a zoe and a bios. I quote Agamben one last time, promise. In modern thought, there are rare but significant attempts to conceive of being beyond the principle of sovereignty. The strongest objection against this principle is contained in Melville's Bartleby, the scrivener, who, with his "I would prefer not to," resists every possibility of deciding between potentiality and the potentiality not to. So then, in the end, would Bartleby be the accurate philosophical equivalent of a private man who minds his own business, who's not a dissimulated king as Odysseus, nor a victim or homo sacer like Air? Could Bartleby be considered as the possible modern reincarnation of Socrates? Is impotentiality the response to the deconstruction of sovereign power? Is it on this mode that the philosopher must descend in the cave by saying, "I would prefer not to," not in disguise, but deprived of essential identity? It is true that Socrates is no hidden king. It is true that his demon intervenes only to discourage him from doing certain things. And yet, I don't think that Socrates would ever say something like, "I would prefer not to." His paradigm is not that of impotentiality, because his soul is always in movement. If there can't be any model of life for the philosopher, it is because such a thing would be a contradiction. It would rigidify or solidify his soul. Plato has a name for the specific philosophical movement of the soul. This name is phronesis, often translated as practical virtue. An essential point for our discussion is that phronesis, as a virtue, situates itself right at the crossing between the biological and the spiritual life of the soul. It exactly occupies the middle between zoe and bios. Phronesis is the crossing point between the soul, understood as the principle of life, of animation, the origin of sensibility and sensuousness, and the soul as the principle of contemplation, concentration, and thinking. Phronesis is what transforms a purely biological into a psychic life. It is then what suppresses the difference between bios and zoe. As Plato says, the philosopher is in a way already dead, but this strange state constitutes the proper strength of the soul. It is a force, an ergon, and not an impotentiality. A force which never ends up in violence, the force of justice. After Plato, Aristotle will, as we know, develop a profound analysis of phronesis, understood as prudence, which is a way to expose and protect oneself at the same time. If the philosopher has to descend in the cave again, he will have to be cautious, prudent, by being able to play with the plasticity of his life, sometimes appearing as a pure zoe, unqualified life, a private man, without qualities, sometimes, on the contrary, as a king philosopher, as a thinker, letting his life appear in its disappearance. A soul able to move from one side of itself to the other at the very crossing point between humanity and animality. Socrates, as we know, is very often compared to an animal, a ray, a horsefly, etc., has his specific mobility again, is in between the species. Socrates does not pass from the human to the animal or from the animal to the human as ordinary souls do. He constitutes the plasticity of transformability of his soul as the very site of phronesis. Therefore, it can be said, as Heidegger notices, the uncanny. I quote Heidegger, "The uncanny has nothing to do with the monstrous or the alarming. The uncanny is the simple, ungraspable by the fangs of the will, withdrawing itself from all artifices and calculation because it surpasses all planning." And I will say that in the end, the answer of this strange model of life is how to become ungraspable, escaping power by becoming, in an uncanny way, ungraspable. And here comes my conclusion. Again, then, it seems that the central question of the myth of air is to know how to return. This question in turn is to be understood as, how is it possible to make a non-violent use of one's force and power when lost in the crowd, when alone in tyranny, when possibly exposed to murder? How to remain sovereign in a non-sovereign way? What model or sample of life is to be chosen for such a return? At the end of the myth, air comes back to life, and Plato does not tell us who air is, if he will remain a soldier, what use he will make of all that he had learned in Hades. Will he return masked? Will he return as a beggar, as an animal, as a phronesis, as a philosopher? Will he say, I would prefer not to return? Will he become a private man who minds his own business, or an ungraspable, uncanny character? Are all of these figures different versions of homini sacri, or do they present an alternative to the very political meaning of the homo sacer? The initial issue of my talk was, if we were to live our lives over again, would we choose the same model? It now appears that such an issue may also be formulated as, is it possible to modify the way in which we expose ourselves to death? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and I think that you're able to take some questions now for a little time. So we have a couple of microphones because the talk will be recorded and it will be actually posted online as well in a little while by the Townsend Center. So if we want to start with some questions, we can then run you through there. I know it's always hard to be the first one to ask a question.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. And this question is not precisely on your topic, but it sort of surrounds it, in the sense that I'm thinking of the choice that Achilles has to make in the Iliad, right? When Achilles is faced with the choice of either becoming a great hero or just becoming an ordinary man. And of course, he makes a choice. And then in the Roman version, when Aeneas goes to visit Achilles in the underworld, Achilles says, I made the wrong choice. So I'm wondering if it's not exactly a return, but it's a kind of revisitation when you move from the Greek to the Roman.
Yes,
and
you're quite
since
right.
you brought up Rome through the Agamben, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit
he
about
remains in his tent.
Mm-hmm.
Am I right? There's a moment where he has to decide. I remember there's a moment when Achilles remains.
Oh, that's when he's in this jealous rage over something else.
Yeah,
right?
so instead of acting, instead of letting his anger come out, he just retains it and remains. And I know that in the Republic, but I couldn't talk about that because I didn't have time. Plato oscillates constantly between Odysseus fighting the suitors and conquering Ithaca again, and Achilles, who is more like in the suspension of his power. And I think the two political figures are extremely important in the myth.
But then when he manifests the rage is when he desecrates the body of I'm losing the name. Hector, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
Hector.
Right, and then that's what Aeneas. So there's a kind of interesting repetition of that.
Repetition.
Yeah.
And the problem is perhaps that it's not so much about letting your rage express itself or retaining it. The problem is how to avoid war in the end. Mm-hmm. Because Socrates, of course, when the philosopher goes back to the cave, of course he's angry as well when he sees that the crowd may attack him. But the problem is how to, in any case, not feel, well, try to never give up anger, rage. And is such a thing possible? I don't know if that was your question, but...
It's more having to do with Aeneas going to see Achilles and having Achilles granted a chance to then rejudge his choice. Right? And at that point he says, if I had it all to do over again,
I would do differently.
But that's the Roman version of it.
Yeah, very interesting. Mm.
I might take a chance to ask a question. It's interesting to me that this particular problematic seems to be even more complicated when you think of Plato's instability of the relationship between the individual understood as the three different zones and the political sphere. And I'm wondering if that might have some impact on the way that you're trying to develop this conclusion.
Yes, well, this is something we study in the seminar, like the three parts of the soul, vegetative, desire, well, the locus of desire and the intellect coincides with the division of the city in three classes, like intellectual, the guardians, desire, the warriors, precisely, and vegetative, the laborers. And it's true that the way in which the soul can govern itself and, yes, organize this hierarchy between the intellectual part of itself and the vegetative one coincides with the way the city has to be ruled. So in a way, you're right that the problem is that of sovereignty and government and how to impose one's own power on the inferior parts and how to organize a hierarchy. And at the same time, because Plato's question is that of how to avoid tyranny, how can we make a difference between that kind of kingship, that is how to impose an order to oneself or to the city, how can we avoid that this economy of power is able not to end into tyranny or dictatorship. So that's why, according to me, the question of sovereignty in Plato is necessarily that of the deconstruction of sovereignty. Because in any case, we have to avoid this economy of power to become an abuse of power. And how is that possible?
And do you feel that that's modeled in some way on the relationship between the intellect or the subject and the body and the brain in other work that you've...
Yes, because I think this is a very interesting question. I think that contrary to many readings of this intellectual power, I don't think that, in fact, Plato's contention is that the soul has to overpower the body. I don't think this is what he says. Precisely, again, it is a mode of, it is an economy of power in which both the body and soul play together, like exchange their determinations. That's why I was talking about the distinction between zoe and bios, which in a way is the distinction between the soul and the body. So I don't think that Plato says, the soul or the intellectual part of the soul has to overpower. I don't think so, because otherwise we wouldn't see what the difference is between a philosopher and a tyrant. I think it's more like an exchange between both.
Did you say the sirens? The difference, did you just say the difference? We don't see the difference between the philosopher and the sirens?
And the tyrant, I'm sorry.
Oh, tyrant. Okay.
Tyrant, yes.
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Mispronounced. No.
So phronesis is with the O, not phronesis with the E. Frenzy as opposed to...
phronesis, Phronesis.
Okay, thank you.
Which is...
spelling, thank you. Is there a gendered version of this? Is there like an uncanny valley girl that can be taken from, say, you know, I mean, I'm thinking about Galatea and Pygmalion and how in many parts of the myths, the women are created rather than becoming themselves. And I don't want to, move in a different direction, but I just wonder about the gendered story of sovereignty.
Yes, that's interesting. And of course, here again, I didn't have time to show that. But a great part, a long part of the myth is about the ordinary souls, let's say, choosing their life samples again. And Plato says that the life paradigms are very various, and they comprise, of course, different professions, but it also comprise genders and species. So your soul can choose to reincarnate as an animal, any kind of animal, or if you were a man, in a woman, and vice versa. So there's a great elasticity of the life models. And it seems that at this point, that's why I also thought of Agamben, that Plato had anticipated this distinction between bios and zoe, and at the same time had thought of the necessity of erasing the difference between them, because the souls can choose between either different bios or different zoe. Again, they can play with the sexes, with the genders, with the qualifications, the non-qualifications, etc. So the problem is that Plato says, if we just play with the, for example, the genders or bios and zoe, we won't really answer the problem of sovereignty. Because most of the time, whatever we choose, we repeat our previous life. So for example, me as a woman, if I reincarnate in a man, this won't make so much difference. Because what will really make a difference, as I was telling David, will be the way in which I will organize this exchange between bios and zoe. Not doing it by instinct like that, or just like by immediate want to choose, but in thinking the way in which I can articulate them. You see what I mean? Yeah.
I'm wondering, in your last question, if there's a different way to expose ourselves to death, if you see Socrates as a model of answering that question.
Yes, this is what I've tried to demonstrate.
So the place where I'm wondering then is, could you just explain a little bit more about how, in perhaps even going to other dialogues, where his difference of thinking about death as a type of release from the body would answer that question?
Yes, it's very interesting also, and this is something we've studied in the seminar as well. Normally, the souls in Hades are just souls. Here, they have bodies as well, and they behave like normal persons. And so the question of the body is very important, as it appears that these souls have a bodily life. They talk, they exchange information, etc., etc. So the afterlife in the myth of air looks very much like this life. And this is the specificity of this myth. And also, there are two other great afterlife myths are in the Gorgias and in the Phaedo. And normally, in Plato, there is only one kind of judgment, which is final. You were just or you were unjust, and then you arrive in front of the judges, and they decide what kind of either punishment or reward you will receive. And this is final. There's no reincarnation. What is very strange here is that we have this reincarnation, as if the judgment was never definitive. And that's why the commentators are so perplexed about the myth. They say, but... And, well, if there is a judgment, why then do we have to reincarnate? Because we will be judged again, etc., etc. So perhaps the answer is that we are alone in such a what Julia Annas calls a cosmic indifference. We alone can let's say, think of the way in which we can make use of our own power. Because whatever the judgment will be, there won't be, in fact, any judgment. Everything will come again, repeat itself again. So it is in this life that we have to determine philosophically the kind of use of one's own power we can do. And anyway, we will die. Anyway, we will be exposed to death. So can there be different ways of doing it? I think Socrates is the one who transforms the question of the choice of life into the one of the choice of death, which is that we have very little time, and within that time, can we elaborate a form of, find the most appropriate way to be exposed to death.
But maybe this is too simplistic, but isn't partially what's done in the Republic is a kind of ode to the philosophical life as a way of creating a type of life that allows you to be exposed to death and at the same time will always to live that way again? And that the philosophical life is seen as the exemplary life.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. Of course, when I say the way in which we want to expose ourselves to death, for Socrates it is clear that the most convincing way of exposing ourselves to death is a way of living philosophically. That philosophy is the answer to that question.
And that's for you, would that be still the life that is choosing a non-sovereign life?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think philosophy is a kind of power which refuses sovereignty. It's a kind of sovereign power which at the same time is a deconstruction of sovereignty. Otherwise, it seems to me, we wouldn't see the difference again between a kind of just mode of power, that of the guardians, that of the philosophers who ruled the city. We wouldn't see the difference between that type of power and that of the sovereign or dictator or tyrant.
Yeah, just to follow up, because my question was actually whether the question for Socrates was his veiling and unveiling or hiding and unhiding, because he's, this is what he's famous for, obviously, is his mode of questioning, but in the cave allegory, he also is a tyrant and, has his mode, and then always returns it with a rhetorical question, which kind of allows him to...
Who is the tyrant? Socrates?
I would say, okay, he has his view, right? And in that sense, he's imposing his view. So I wonder if that's, he's, in narrating the allegory of the cave, he's being a kind of tyrant saying, don't you think, Glaucon, that's the way it should be? And then Glaucon has to say yes or no. But the rhetorical question is a gesture towards undermining his own tyrant.
Yes, of course.
And
in a way, yes.
oh no, and then also thinking of Odysseus as becoming a philosopher for that moment when he becomes a beggar because he goes into the house, into his own house, and I think he's advised to go see who is the good and who is the bad, but it doesn't change that he's going to kill them all anyway. So he gets this moment.
You're quite right. This is the problem. It doesn't change that he will kill them all. And this is precisely what the philosopher does not do. He could kill them all. He could. He has the power. It is clear that Hegel says somewhere it was normal that Socrates was sentenced to death because he was a real threat to the city. This is true because he had the power to kill them all, not physically, but intellectually, as you said, because he has this questioning force who, you remember the metaphor of the ray? He says, I'm paralyzing my interlocutors. So in a way, he has the power to kill them all. But he won't do it. And that's the difference. Okay? That's why he is and he's not Odysseus at the same time.
Thank you.
He will refrain, as you said, he will deconstruct his own sovereignty. This is very true.
Thank you.
We have time for another question.
Thank you very much. I guess I'm going to jump on her question too and just say back with respect to Bartleby, the philosopher has the power. He could kill them all, but he doesn't. So isn't that the instantiation of the philosopher saying, I would prefer not to?
No, you're right. This is why I really, I mean, this is why I thought that Agamben's, I think Agamben's question is a genuine question. After all, it's not the philosophical power, this impotentiality, a way of being a tyrant which is not, would deconstruct, etc., etc. But I'm not, I don't know what you think, but I don't think this is very satisfying to talk of an impotentiality in the case of Socrates. Of course, he says, in a way, he says, I would prefer not to. But if you remember, Bartleby is absolutely passive, with no will, precisely no intellectual power either, no questioning power. He doesn't have any relationship to truth or to the will. And this is what bothers me in Agamben's analysis, because I think you can try to deconstruct sovereignty and at the same time to remain a sovereign in the positive sense, to become an autonomous individual with a will and with a force. Bartleby has no, I mean, he has no impact on the souls precisely, or I don't know.
Okay, one more question, and then.
But we have time. I mean.
Okay, well, sure. If you're okay, we can take some questions.
Thank you. I wanted to take it to the text. I was really struck by the moment when you said something like Plato has a suggestion that we can wear our masks not as a temporary ruse, but as a permanent ontological displacement of sovereignty. And I wanted to invite you to reflect about maybe the role that the forgetting has in that process or in that possibility of displacement. If you have first the judgment and then the choice to take on this life, is the forgetting, what role does the forgetting play in that displacement?
Yes, very interesting as well. Also very difficult question. Like we have to drink the Lethe water and go back and forget about everything. And even philosophy has to forget about itself. I think this is, to me, it is absolutely part of the deconstruction of sovereignty. A just mode of power, a non-sovereign or abusive mode of power, is a power which is able to forget itself. And you have the same idea in Nietzsche, that the true, the will to power coincides with what he calls the active forgetting. True power is the oblivion of itself. If you remain in the memory of your own power, you will just want to keep it, just want to preserve it, and in that sense, exclude the others from it. So I think that the forgetfulness is an essential part of this political economy of power. Thank you for your question.
Hi, thank you so much. I've learned so much from this lecture. I was wondering if you, the question of the false philosopher, and so if the philosopher leaves the caves and goes to the crowd, and he is not going to be received by an angry crowd, by a dismissive crowd, and therefore will no longer wield any power. And I'm wondering if you've ever, what would you say to the question of the philosopher being false and having to utilize, and in the case of maybe anticipating being marked as a false philosopher, then having to make the decision to lie to the crowd and utilize other methods of transmitting the forms, like metaphors.
I'm laughing. Yes, thank you very much for your question. I'm laughing because, as you know, or may not know, Alain Badiou just made a new translation of the Republic, which is interesting because it's full of new words, where it introduces contemporaneity into the Republic. And according to Badiou, it is very clear that the philosopher is a tyrant, that he has to lie to the crowd, and that he has to impose precisely what you said, as a tyrant, this is Badiou. Okay? That, yes, philosophy has no other choice that to impose itself by ways of violence. And this is also a true question, I guess. I mean, is the revolutionary force of philosophy does it have to be in itself a revolution? Do we have to make the revolution in order to force people to think philosophically? According to Badiou, yes, clearly. He says, a life without a revolution is not a life. Let's commit suicide instead, which is another way of exposing oneself to death. Of course, I'm not sure, even if, in Plato, there are some hints of tyranny. I mean, the distribution of the children, we know that Popper has denounced the totalitarian character of the Republic. Nevertheless, I don't think that the philosopher has to lie to the crowd. And I think that we can read Plato as someone who said that philosophy had no chance to win, ever. That we have to go back to the cave, but in knowing that it is a desperate process. I think we have two possibilities at that point. Either Badiou and the violence and philosophy has to be imposed. And communism, Marxism, has something to do with that. And Popper very strongly says, well, Plato is the inventor of communism. Or you have the other possibility, which is the way in which I'm interested more, which is no. We know that it is a lost cause, but still, we do it. Thank you. I don't know what to... Yeah, we take two more. And
I think my question goes very much in this direction, actually. I was very much struck by the example that you were analyzing of Odysseus's strange choice of the private individual, the idiot. And it made me think of another possible connection, maybe perhaps you've thought of it, at the end of Plato's Apology, as Socrates, who is about to accept his death, emphasizes the fact that he had always remained a private individual rather than being a citizen, rather than participating in, rather than being a ruler, rather than participating in the
democracy of the state, and rather than acting in the politics of the state, he had always been a private individual, and this is why he was so suspect, but it's also what gave him the ability and the right to go around questioning philosophically. And I wondered if this also was not very much playing a role in your the argument that you beautifully laid out, and also if in the end what that leads us to is Odysseus's choice as the choice of gesturing towards the choice of being a Socrates and being able to question and to be the gadfly and to insert Socratic irony as the private individual.
No, you're right. Of course, as we can see in the myth, Odysseus and Socrates are both mirroring each other, and at the same time they are different. Because you're quite right, Socrates is a private man, but he does not mind his own business. That's the great difference. And it makes, well, I remember something when you evoke the apology, where Socrates, it's a very beautiful passage where he accepts his death and says, I hope I will be able to meet Odysseus' soul in Hades. He said, this is my hope. This is a very beautiful passage. And we can see that Plato has this this intense relationship to Homer. And I think that it would be interesting to study the relationship between Odysseus and Socrates in Plato's writing. And thank you also for this remark. I think we have a last question. Yes, yes.
So Popper includes Hegel with Plato and Marx as a tyrant or totalitarian. I was wondering if, so Hegel has the idea of the beautiful soul who refuses to get his hands dirty. Maybe that's Bartleby.
No, this Bartleby is very puzzling. The beautiful soul in the phenomenology of spirit, you're quite right, is a very interesting moment when the soul is so much trapped into ethical paradoxes that it is unable to act. So the beautiful soul in Hegel is the romantic soul, which is so virtuous that in the end, it never makes a decision. But I don't think at all that Hegel would have accepted to identify Socrates with the beautiful soul. Because for Hegel, it is clear, again, that Socrates deserved his death because he made decisions. And he was not like this romantic kind of soul. But I think that you're right, that the model of the beautiful soul might be that of Bartleby, but it is not that of Socrates, I guess. But thank you for this. It's very interesting. Okay, so thank you for your patience.